This week on Breezy Breakfast, we hear about one solution that might help solve our housing crisis. Our guest Floyd Marinescu speaks passionately about some new and old economic theories that might work for government, homeowners, and renters. Floyd argues that a land value tax would make life simpler for everyone by lowering the cost of living, encouraging new builds, and discouraging the idea that housing should be looked at as an investment. Land value taxation shifts our thinking about housing. It is not a commodity, but rather a place for people to live. What exactly is a land value tax, and how may it help alleviate the housing crisis? Now over to our moderator, Phil.
We are joined today by Ken and Floyd, who will be talking about alternatives to the current economic model for housing in Canada. Having said that, I'd like to begin with our normal territorial acknowledgement, but I'm going to diverge just a bit and read why we do territorial acknowledgements. Why acknowledge territory? Territorial acknowledgement is a way that people insert an awareness of Indigenous presence and land rights in everyday life. This is often done at the beginning of ceremonies, lectures, or any public event. It can be a subtle way to recognize the history of colonialism and a need to change in settler colonial society. However, these acknowledgements can easily be a token gesture rather than a meaningful practice. All settlers, including recent arrivals, have a responsibility to consider what it means to acknowledge the history and legacy of colonialism. What are some of the privileges settlers enjoy today because of colonialism? How can individuals develop relationships with people whose territory they are living on in contemporary Canadian geopolitical landscapes? What are you or your organization doing beyond acknowledging the territory where you live, work, or hold your events? What might you be doing that perpetuates settler colonial futurity rather than considering alternative ways forward for Canada? Do you have an understanding of the ongoing violence and trauma that is part of the structure of colonialism? And with that, I would like to acknowledge all the Indigenous people today who are experiencing the catastrophic fires that are raging across Canada and that impact people in many remote communities far more than they might be impacting Toronto or Guelph today. Welcome, Floyd, and I'd like to welcome you to Breezy Breakfast today. We are certainly all ears because, as we all know, housing in Ontario and Guelph and in Canada today is tremendously challenging. Just yesterday, we saw in one of the local papers that it would require a family income of well over $200,000 to enter the housing market in Guelph today. This is indeed a princely sum for many and makes housing virtually inaccessible. When we are hearing that rents in Guelph are anywhere between about $2,400 and over $3,000 for a 2 or a 3 bedroom unit today, we wonder often how families, how new Canadians, and how young people can afford to live in a community like Guelph, or perhaps even Toronto, or dare I say, in Vancouver. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Floyd as we broach the question, what can we do differently, and what's being done differently in places like the United States, where some of what Floyd is going to talk about are being attempted today. Welcome, Floyd.
Thank you very much. So I'm here to talk about a very old idea that goes to the founding of economics itself into contemporary understanding. It's the old idea of a land value tax, of a primary means of taxation and how that could impact the housing market. And it actually leads very much into what the land acknowledgement questions you're asking about go. But, what is our role in this? And it fundamentally comes down to who profits from land and how. I became very interested in the housing crisis and systemic solutions to the crisis, and came across this idea of land value tax, and that would really change how the housing market, how our economy will for the better. So let's get started. I'm here to make this statement that the only way we can adequately address the housing market, the housing crisis, is to actually lower the price of housing. It's an obvious thing, right? Housing is already too expensive. Lower it quickly, soon. The best way to accomplish that is to make homes less attractive as long-term investment, meaning homes should reflect people's need to live, not as a primary wealth creation vehicle, because that's what's driving up and bidding up prices. That would change the composition of who is buying in the housing market and why. it wouldn't make housing, it wouldn't less attractive. It wouldn't change people's ability to earn wealth. It just changed how they do it. Homes themselves would become a means primarily of living, and the market would reflect real world needs to live. And the fairest way to do that is going back to this old idea in economics about how land value is created, because land value is the primary and the largest source of housing price increase. And reflecting that, society creates land value. Land value goes up due to society's investments, public investments, societal progress, technological progress. And it would be better a system if we enhance people's take-home pay from their own work, from their own investments in their home, while society itself claims rising land value since it's the one that creates it. These three things. If we achieve this, we could have a housing market that reflects, again, people's need to live, not the increased pricing that's reflecting from investment incentives. And housing would be permanently cheaper, and the housing market will work better. The incentives around creating more supply, NIMBYism, all these things I think would be impacted. So let's go deeper into what this actually means. I said the only way to adequately address the housing market is to actually lower the price. We've seen several successive decades where the price of homes just keeps going up faster than people's incomes, faster than other asset classes, faster than the economy as a whole. What's driving this? We've become used to it. Rising house prices is actually negatively affecting society. The higher home prices are, the slower the economy becomes, because the less money people have to spend, less discretionary income people have to spend on going out for dinner, or buying a car, or going on vacation. It makes life harder for everyone, especially the younger generation. You can't build a happy and productive society this way. If you go on the forums, listen to young people talk about housing, there's a lot of despair. People are putting off when they're going to have kids until they can afford their first home. It's crazy. There's a lot of anger. They're seeing government policies are primarily raising prices even higher. No one's actually speaking to how to lower prices. It's dramatically increasing wealth inequality and the wealth gap. And while we know about the differences between the top 1% and everyone else, there's actually a greater threat to society is not a handful of billionaires. It's actually the growing wealth gap between the 60% of Canadians who own homes and the 40% who don't. Between 1999 and 2019, the average wealth of renters of all income categories, including high income earners who are renting, increased by only $10,000. But the average wealth of homeowners increased by $380,000. And that's 38 times more. And that's before COVID increased another 50%. Like, that's crazy. Like, that is a huge gap, a huge wedge separating people in society. So we hear from every politician about how we want homes to be more affordable, but no one dare speak the truth that the bottom 40%, not the bottom really, just 40% who don't own need lower prices. And what needs to happen for that is to reduce the incentives that are enriching people who just happen to have gotten there first to own a property at a different time and place. Even looking at the government's signature housing affordability offering, the first-time homebuyers incentive, they'll front 5 to 10% of the value of a home, but that just adds more fuel to the fire that bids prices up even more. Even worse, they'll pick a scapegoat: billionaires, speculators, foreign buyers. They create a luxury tax, a speculators tax. Maybe one day there'll be a tax against institutional investors. They'll ban BlackRock or something. But it's not really going to matter. A lot of these things have been tried, and they don't really work. So I think these solutions reflect political incentives, is that every party wants to cater to the homeownership class because they're the primary voting bloc. And nobody wants to say, hey, prices should come down. Most you might hear people speak of affordability, but all these solutions, we know another 50,000 homes in Ontario won't matter. Another 2 million homes in Canada won't really matter when the incentives are still there to keep bidding up the price due to the fact that homes are a fabulous wealth creation vehicle, better than stocks and bonds, safer than stocks and bonds, and require very little work to achieve those gains. So if we're going to do this, we have to make a significant trade-off, recognizing between owners and non-owners, between this generation and the next generation. And the trade-off, I think, is that we all agree to make housing and land not really an investment asset, land particularly. Instead, we can create wealth through our jobs or through investments in businesses and stocks, things that actually make capitalism work. So how do we do that? How do we make homes less attractive as a long-term investment? Well, let's go deeper. The reason why Canadians are willing to spend 40, 50, or 60% of their incomes on mortgage payments or rent, or mortgage payments in particular, is because it's a rational financial thing to do. People during COVID have been buying apartments in a negative cash flow position, renting them out, because they believe and they're right that in the long term, the value of these homes will go up anyway, and they'll eventually make that money back when they sell. That's actually a very precarious position. That's actually literally called a Ponzi position, because you're literally in a negative position that is very fragile. And this bidding behavior, this exuberance, has pushed prices up even more. And we're all encouraging that. So homes are a good investment, and everyone knows and believes not only that long-term it always works, but the government will also come in and save the day. The government will bail people out. At the beginning of COVID, the very first thing they did was ensure that no one defaulted on their mortgages. Even now, like, society is working together to ensure people stay in their homes. Obviously, they should, but the impact is more debt. So, homes perform better than stocks and bonds and other investments. They have lower volatility, lower risk. Housing appreciation is tax exempt. All the incentives are there to keep prices going up and up, because, again, reflecting there are two primary motivations to buy a home. It's either one is to live and the other is as wealth creation. And these two cannot exist together in any world where we expect to have affordability. They just can't. And this is an unfortunate truth that any society will have to contend with if we'll ever have real lasting permanent change. So the simplest way to bring down the attractiveness of any asset, whether it's a house or a car you rent out or any asset, is to reduce its yield, is to reduce the return it can create, so that the asset becomes worth less as a financial instrument and worth more as an actual home where we can customize and make personal to us and love. So this means removing the expectation to profit off long-term price appreciation. And with the ethos of land value tax, which goes all the way back to Adam Smith and the first economists, it means that the rental value of land is a better source of taxation for society, since society creates its value, versus the yield of the home itself belongs to the owner, because the owner is the one that invests and maintains that. That's real capital. That's real investment. There's a difference between land and the home. Land is not capital. It was here before us, will be here after us, versus the home itself that we create. It is capital created by capitalism, and that's what makes capitalism work. So the fairest way to do that, as I kind of got into, is that society reclaims the majority of value of land it creates. It doesn't impact at all tenure or private ownership. That's sacrosanct. Everyone owns their land, owns their homes, but the value of it, its rental value, can be taxed, and that's much better than other solutions that are being proposed to try and address the housing market. It's better because it's fairer. So we say that homeowners get to keep all the value they create by improving and maintaining and constructing on their land and improving their homes. But we keep less of the value that society creates by land appreciation. Because the majority of the increase in home values since World War II has been land, roughly 80% of it. So it's clear that could be addressed through a policy like this. So rather than limiting the freedoms of homeowners or passing arbitrary taxes, penalizing specific segments of society that are maybe buying more, demonizing foreign owners or all these things, or having special tax privileges, or all these needs to constantly do bailouts during upturns and downturns. We can just have society take a direct stake in increasing land values as opposed to private profit incentives, and increase and enhance people's personal take home from their work. So what does that mean in practice? Here's the plan. I mentioned enhanced returns from labor, so reduce income taxes, and that could be achieved through a land value tax that equates to roughly 4.16%, 4% of the tax on current values of land is enough to collect roughly 3/4 of the rental value of land as an asset. So basically taxing 3/4 of the rental value of land. And doing so would cause land prices to fall by 75%, which sounds pretty extreme because it would be returning less as an asset, and the median home would be worth 42% less when such a reform is announced. And of course, such a reform will not happen overnight. It'll be a slow 20-year rollout of such a shift from income taxes to land value taxes. But the moment it's announced, the market would already react because people would expect that housing would have a lesser return, and these decreases in prices would happen fairly quickly. And we've seen that actually in other parts of the world that have made small shifts to land tax or announced changes to incentives to profit from land. Things happen fast, even if the tax shift hasn't happened yet. So that's why this would happen fairly quickly and lead to affordability. So this a land value tax of roughly 4% on the current value of land means a 17% on the after adjustment tax. Land being worth 3/4 less, it would be a 17% tax on that is roughly the same as a 4% tax on today's values, just to get a sense of it. Would raise $194 billion, which would be enough to raise the 0% tax bracket all the way up to $75,000, which means nobody would have to pay any tax at all on the first $75,000 of income earned by their retirement portfolios or through their jobs. That would revitalize, really revitalize the economy, simplify a lot of people's lives, and create a lot more fairness, because it means that all of us are profiting from rising land values together fairly equally through investments by the government in public services, through through the health of our community. You wouldn't have the schism between owners and renters. People keep more of their earnings. They're incentivized to work harder because they keep more of their money. And let's look at how the housing market would work, and then I'll stop for questions. Having a land value tax would change the way demand, supply, and allocation incentives work. Specifically, would really address the supply crisis because you're incentivized to build more on your land and not have underutilized land, specifically in city centers. So if you're in a city center, let's say you're like just outside of here, a plot of land that's the same size as a high rise, but is occupied by a home, they pay the same land tax. So the owner of the home would be incentivized to sell and build a high rise because that land is been deemed by society, its value is high enough that there really should be high rises there. And land on the periphery would be a lot cheaper. Would reflect the fact that it's further away from the jobs, further away from these things. So a lot of NIMBYism would be addressed, because if you're in a Toronto City Core and there's areas of like 1 or 2 story homes, really where there should be skyscrapers, like this tax would coax people to sell, to elect city councilors, change the zoning, because this tax would effectively align market incentives with people that actually need to live. We've seen this happen in other parts of the world. So this is what I'm proposing, of a full-on tax shift, a full large collection of land tax. This isn't happening to this extent anywhere. This is a theory that is as old as economics itself. But we've seen partial transitions to land tax. Many municipalities, for example, in Pennsylvania, several towns in Pennsylvania, in Denmark, in Singapore, in Taiwan, have partial land tax shifts. In Pennsylvania, they did a revenue neutral shift from property tax to land tax. That's something Guelph could do. And in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, they did a revenue neutral, so the government made the same amount of money before and after, but they just tweaked that more of it comes from land than property. They saw a 30% faster acceleration of construction. They saw many new businesses. They credit a revitalization of the downtown core of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, due to this change. Right now, the mayor of Detroit is actively campaigning on a tax shift to a land tax, and so a city could do this. It wouldn't go as far as a full income tax shift that would require a federal and provincial governments to work together. On that, but a municipality could do a partial shift from property taxes as well and achieve some of these benefits on the supply and demand side. It wouldn't achieve a dramatic price reduction, which is how I started the thesis of this talk, but it would improve at least the incentives for construction and make the downtowns work better. So that's the suggestion and proposal, and how we can make our housing market work better. and I need to decide what I'm having for breakfast.
I think we've had many points that have been raised by Floyd that are both thoughtful and also possibly controversial as well. And similarly, there might be aspects of this that are challenging. And I have a number of different questions that I'm going to ask, but I'm going to wait a little bit for Floyd. The areas that I'm going to be speaking about are I'm going to ask Floyd to expand upon the old idea of the land value tax and consider it in terms of its legality relative to property taxes in Ontario today, which are really, for many of us, as old as time itself. Similarly, I'm hoping that Floyd can talk about areas such as Denmark and Singapore, how they've done that. And I'll also ask him a little bit about supply and demand economics. So that now that Lloyd has dealt with the most important thing, which is breakfast, and Floyd, I'm sorry, I keep calling you Lloyd. Keep slapping my wrists for that too, please. First thing that I'd like to ask you about, now you've mentioned that this is an old idea, but that it's one that has been applied in places like Denmark, Singapore, and even as close as Pennsylvania in the United States. I was wondering if you could just expand upon that, because we have a property tax system in Ontario that's very much entrenched within the law and within civic finances. How do we transform from a property tax system to a land value tax? What would we see?
Okay, so there actually was a law in the early 1900s. A provincial law was passed allowing cities to transition from property to land tax, because these ideas were very popular back then. There was a reformer named Henry George in the late 1800s that really put this on the map. And I think Alberta went wildly into this idea at one point. This is before income taxes existed. So what the city would simply do what the towns in Pennsylvania did and what Detroit's considering doing, which is simply start to shift the taxation system municipally from property to lands in a revenue neutral way. The mayor of Detroit, which is very recent, predicts that it will provide tax relief to over 90% of the homes, which are on lands that are I mean, Detroit's a unique case. The lands are less valuable than the homes. So over there, the intent is to kind of bring people a little closer together to increase the quality of the transactions. But let's look at Denmark. Denmark had a huge Georgist movement. That's Henry George, named after Henry George, and kept robust land taxes from for since the early 1900s. But recently, we saw an interesting phenomenon. Recently, there was a shift in jurisdictions in Denmark that put some homes arbitrarily out of one county into another. These counties had different levels of land and property tax. So researchers looked at this and found that homes that suddenly magically became in a higher land tax county reduced, the prices came down for those homes commensurately, like almost one-to-one. Was decapitalization is the word for it, because again, this asset yields less on an expected return basis. Its price comes down. The more you tax something, the lower its price. We tax carbon to pollute less. You tax land, it'll be worth less. It's kind of simple in that regard. And so this happened in Denmark. So they literally witnessed in action this theory play out in this what was not an experiment, but can be treated as such. And in counties where people's land tax burden decreased, the housing prices went up like really quickly. So if you want to make the housing price roll, just reduce property taxes, and that'll be even more expensive, and that will make things even worse. So this is a recent thing seen in Denmark. So that proves the thesis, and it's been seen in many other experiments that higher land taxes means lower land prices, which is kind of a key to affordability. But in Pennsylvania, it's more relevant because it's more recent. Some of these changes reflecting the fact that it did lead to more construction. It did lead to better supply incentives. It did lead to more small businesses opening in the city cores, or these are not cities, towns and villages. These things happened, and that's why now the mayor of Detroit is like all in, wants to shift to a land tax to revitalize the city. Places like Taiwan. This happened 100 years ago. But when they acquired the land from the Japanese, they maintained a land tax system. After that, places like Singapore and China don't actually necessarily directly have a land value tax. What they do is they lease lands primarily to homeowners on a time limited basis, but it can kind of simulate the same dynamic. I would argue that leasing approach is a little less free market than a land value tax, which allows people on an annual basis, allows people to make more dynamic decisions with where they live and how. So a city could simply effect a tax shift to it. But I think the big prize is for a provincial government. Obviously, they would need permission from the provinces. And some people running, I believe Nate Erskine-Smith and Ted Sioux, who are running for Liberal Canadian leadership, want to have the province of Ontario enact a law that would allow cities to transition to a land tax and even have a pilot somewhere. Maybe if Nate ends up winning, maybe it can be Guelph. That'd be really cool for such a municipal transition. But I think the real prize we should be pursuing is an income tax shift, is to literally, if we want to have prices, we can affect better supply and demand dynamics by shifting from property to land. But if we really want to have prices below, we need to go to tax the majority of the rental value of land. So where does that money come from? It should come from reducing income taxes, because no one can afford to pay more tax, right? We don't want a tax grab, we want a tax shift. And so the real prize is for the province and the federal government to raise the basic personal amount, tax-free, as high as possible, to compensate for shifting how we pay tax to land. And there would really be a lot of equity in that, because renters would be really much better off. Renters already pay a full land value tax. They pay it to their landlords. It's baked into the rent that they pay. So that component of the rent they pay, of the land component, going all the way back to Adam Smith, one of the most famed first economists, the 1700s, said this is the best tax. Like, just tax the rental value of land, because no one worked for that. It's unearned. Society creates it. And Adam Smith and the first economists in France, which Adam Smith also was mentored by, recognized that the land owning class always ends up taking most of the productivity of society by slowly increasing rents over time, which is why working class people today can never actually catch up. Like, prices the dynamic still existed in farm agricultural areas, still exists today. And it's certainly seen as an unfair thing that, it's not our fault. We didn't create the system. We're just in it. But we can fix this. And, to your land acknowledgement question in the beginning, it's the same incentives that have driven colonialism. It's acquiring land value increasing, controlling land and controlling these assets. So a system like this that Adam Smith, Henry George, the first economist, suggested would be a system where we're sharing in the value of nature, the value of land, not allowing anyone to hoard it more than they need, at least more than they can put to productively use. Because in capitalism, we generally agree if you're being productive, you're creating products and services for society, then you're doing your part. So, the system would encourage people to use only as much as they need to be productive, and not more than that. Or else they'd be paying too much.
Thanks very much. That was really important and really interesting as well. I want to just go to a few points that I've got here, and then go to some questions that we have. Those that are joining us around the table, I think we have an assortment of both tenants and homeowners as well, and I'm sure that there are many, many opinions here, as well as those that are joining us on Zoom. The one thing that concerns me, Floyd, and it's not about the land value tax. It's about our current economic model, and that's the mythology of supply and demand, which strikes me that has become really, really out of balance in the last 40 years as a consequence of neoliberal economic theories. I was wondering if you could just comment on housing as a right versus housing as an investment or commodity from which we profit.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's kind of what this talk has kind of touched on, that. Housing as a right versus housing as an economic investment. First of all, I believe housing should be a right, and everyone deserves a place to live. And there's a historical basis to this. Some of my mentors in this journey, Guy Standing, Carl Weatherquist, these are famed economists who promote basic income, point out that, historically speaking, land was free. People had access to hunt, to fish, to cultivate, to pick berries. It was called the commons. No one had to pay for it. So people's right to subsist was already guaranteed just by simply being alive. You didn't have to work a job to survive. People organized themselves into communities where it was free. They cultivated fields together. No one charged them a rent. And people worked as little as possible to have a good life and cultivate what they needed for self-reliance and subsistence. So the private landed property system, the feudal land system, kind of upended that. And over 1,000 years in Europe, we had something called the enclosures, where more land was being enclosed, taken by more feudal lords away from people, which resulted in the need for everyone to have a job in order to make enough money to afford a home to live in. So the argument historically that this right was always there, and now we don't have the right anymore. And homelessness is a result. I mean, it is a result shown by research. The result of higher home prices, higher land prices drives homelessness because people have been cut off from this historical access, this historical right that they had to subsist on their own without needing to depend or rely on anyone else. So now, no one would argue to reverse that. So obviously, the private land system has resulted in the incentives to create dramatic economic prosperity. We've seen that in China. In China, when the initial reforms began in the 1970s towards market liberalism, one of the first things the government did is tell farmers, hey, you can keep the results of your work. Your profit is your own. It no longer goes to the state, but you have to lease land from the state because that wasn't your land. That resulted in 10% year over year GDP growth for 30 years. Like the miracle that is China's growth is from letting people keep the results of their work, but still taxing land, changing the way land value, maintaining that in the public sphere. And that led to extraordinary market-based growth. So this solution has precedent. I mean, I'm not saying China doesn't do land value tax explicitly, it does land leasing, but it simulates some of the economic impacts of it. So in a free market system, we can guarantee people's rights to homes if we share it more equally in the growing value of land, because that money that comes from land value tax could be used to pay for basic income, could be used to fund affordable housing, but more importantly, it will stop the incentives that keeps bidding up pricing faster and more sustainably than it needs to be.
That really helps a lot, and I don't think it's necessarily the case that we're going to learn all that we need to improve our housing crisis from just what's happening in Canada. I'm sure that we can learn much from this offshore as well. There are a couple of points, though, as well that I think are really important. It strikes me that your suggestion is only one part of a solution, and I'll tell you why. Nobody would believe that I'm a senior because I look so young and spring-like, but I am, and I own my house. And I don't think that I am atypical. I think there are many seniors that see their houses as essentially their retirement nest egg. And so I am wondering, how do we address the issue of seniors like, not me, but others, because I'm so youthful, perhaps downsizing or going into rentals? How do we deal with Airbnbs and short-term rentals? How do those impact the housing market? And also, what about things like Landlord and Tenant Act that protect tenants? I was wondering I know that's a lot, but I'm hoping that have some breakfast first.
You have to remind me which specific reforms?
Seniors in big houses. Let's deal with that one first. How do we deal with that? It's my nest egg, we'll say.
Yeah, and this is the primary obstacle. So I think in any realistic system, any realistic transition, we have to take into account the needs, the safety, the dignity, the rights of obviously of seniors, and ensure that they can stay in their homes. So probably what would happen is a land tax for people who meet certain criteria could be passed on as a lien on the property that effectively would only be paid on sale. So people can stay in their homes for the generation that frankly has done the best in our current economy, that bought homes the cheapest, realized the most price appreciation, can stay in their homes. However, the incentives would be there for them to choose out of their own free will if they want to downsize, because if we have a land tax that's funding a better retirement, maybe funding something like a basic income or some sort of compensatory approach, I mean, it just, all the incentives are there to right size without being coerced to right size. So that is a, and I would hope that we could convince seniors that this is a vote for your children and your grandchildren to be able to have more affordability, to live closer to you, to have lower taxes, more simplicity, and didn't even mention the environmental benefits because this tax encourages more green space, less urban sprawl, and if you apply this taxation ethos to other kinds of natural resources, it leads to more conservation as well.
Wouldn't the issue be dealt with by the long time frame to implement this land value tax?
So when I first learned about this, I was under the impression, before going deeper on the research, that if you roll it in slow enough, the home prices might just stay stagnant and allow people's wages to catch up and overtake. But some of the leading experts in the field believe it wouldn't. The moment you announce a tax, even if it's rolled out over 20 years slowly, the market would respond. And there is some precedent for that because in Ontario in the 70s, the Conservative government implemented a land speculators tax announced overnight with no warning. And a number of real estate owners, in hindsight, claimed the market crashed, although the premier at the time, I forgot his name, says Bill Davis doesn't remember that it crashed. So the market will respond quickly to such a tax. Now that tax was very poorly designed. It didn't really work. It was rolled out after a while. It was too targeted. It's not something broad-based like what we're talking about here. But who knows? Maybe it wouldn't respond that way. Maybe it would actually just slow down or freeze home prices for a while. Like for instance, this is interesting research, but research in Manhattan showing that if you build a 10% increase in housing stock, like 10,000 units in an area, would a couple of years later result in only a 1% drop in rents within a 2-mile radius. So more construction can lead to a freezing of rents, but it needs to be a lot. Imagine that's only a few blocks. We need a lot of it. And I think a land value tax would encourage that. So I certainly wouldn't want to see a government instrumented fast reduction of prices. But that's what the experts believe would happen.
It sounds to me like this would dramatically increase the role of government in both the economy and within social context. So I'm just wondering if you could comment on how government regulation would relate to this change in the system.
Well, I'd like to hear from you what you see the increasing role of government being, because it could be argued either way. So what do you see? And I can talk to that.
It would sound to me like the government would have to regulate this process quite dramatically. They would have to institute a whole regime that would change basically the economic process. I mean, I certainly think what would happen with people on fixed incomes, what would happen on this huge number, I believe, of ramifications to this setting up this sort of system. So I just we're just curious about what the role of government is.
I'll point out that I don't see the chat stream, but someone mentioned Henry George's single tax idea. This idea was initially put forth by free market economists who saw it as a less invasive and less intrusionary means of financing a society than all the other plethora and net of taxes and regulations. Effectively, it means you pay for what you use, not what you make. So paying for what you use is easier, less intrusive, and more libertarian in a sense than a system where government is taking more of what you make. Simply put, it's when you're paying for what you use, you know how much you owe. It's quite simple. It's less bureaucratic. You can't tax evade it. You can't move your land to the Bahamas. It results in a lot less complexity and government interactions than we have now for the vast majority of working people. Now, areas where it might be a little more government would be, well, you need. We already have property assessment. It would just be done better. You have more land assessment, so the value of your land has to be decided on through some means that is fair and is just and can be contested. But we already have property assessment now, so it's just something that'll be done a little bit better. So yeah, in a transition, we might need more government involvement to ensure that seniors are taken care of and that that low-income people are taken care of. But long term, this is generally seen as a more free market oriented means of taxation. In fact, Milton Friedman, who's a champion of the right-leaning economics, says this is the least bad tax of all taxes. And Karl Marx, founder of communism, said didn't like the idea. He said a land value tax would help capitalism survive longer than it should.
Well, that's the left and the right of it for sure. Tanya, you have a couple of points, I believe, that have come up on Zoom.
Yes. First, I would like to ask about rent control. It seems to me that it is essentially just a land value tax payable to the tenant. Is it necessarily that different?
Great question. And that, you must have studied this issue before. So the issue here is the term in economics is called economic rents. What is the unearned income arising from simply possessing something? Landlords achieve economic rents off their land because they possess it, they can raise prices. Rent controls shift a bit of those economic rents to the tenant. So if you're paying less than what the actual market value is, then the tenant has some benefit there. So it's not the same, but it would sort of in the spirit of it, it would be society as a whole capturing the rent, more of the rental value of land, and then giving it back to tenants, giving it back to everyone more equally in the form of this tax cut in the form of public services. So tenants would be much better off because again, part of the land rent they're paying, whether they're paying less of it or more of it based on rent control, that land rent would be serving societal interests. And this tax has nothing to do with rent control or zoning. It's independent of that. It would actually probably force zoning changes to happen faster, which is good. Like, I don't know why we're celebrating this whole fourplex idea. Maybe it should be sixplexes or eightplexes. But it would kind of push that to happen a little bit faster due to just pure market incentives.
One question has to do with the gap between market value and the assessed value of a property. Property taxes are based on the assessed value. So how are land value taxes assessed?
And this is where I'm not an economist or a land assessor. I can just tell you that this problem. This is a solved problem. There are multiple means of assessing land value. Obviously, the land price, the pricing as the market dictates it, is the number one issue. But there are some irregularities. For instance, like you could have two plots of land right next to each other, and one has a huge luxury house on it, and the other one has a smaller home on it, and the difference in price may not be as great as one would expect. So the value of the property itself really depends on how much someone's willing to pay for it, versus the value of the land is maybe a larger share. So how it's assessed, I can't really explain that in detail. That's a function of professionals. I just know that I've read many prominent economists say that this can be done and it can be fair, and it's not an unresolved issue.
And from that, I'm just going to read a question out. The question comes from Mandy, who is working, and so I think it's better if I read this out. Mandy, I think, raises a very important question. It is. I'm sorry if I've missed something. I'm listening while I work and not watching the chat. I'm always concerned by the words free market. Would this system incentivize developers to cram people into small spaces and create substandard housing? Would it allow for or encourage more development on land we should preserve? It's funny that Mandy asked that question because I was going to ask what the impact on agricultural land would be.
Yeah, great question. So first, we should look at some of the problems with the current system. I mean, in many parts of Canada, 100% of condos are being bought by people who don't live there. That means developers are designing these shoebox apartments not for the needs of the actual buyer who wants to live there, who will think about what's best for them, but for a middleman who will just have something offered as small and cheap as possible to get people in. So we're already, the current system incentivizes building shoeboxes. In a system where the composition of who's buying and why has changed, that a lot of people who just can afford a second, third property might just buy stocks instead, because that has a better return, then the main buyers would be homeowners. And the main offers of rental accommodations would probably be professional companies The way we all know, we want more large, high-rise rental buildings because at that scale, it's profitable, and it's a good business to be in the business of offering purpose-built rental that's built to the needs of families. So the composition of the market would change. I think homes would be designed for the needs of the owners more so than investors, and you would see better quality homes like we had in the 70s. Those are always larger properties. So I don't think the system would encourage better use of land. I don't think that doesn't necessarily mean like smaller units or like to the level that we have today. Incidentally, right now in Canada, about a third of all properties across the country are owned by people who don't live there. So that's how the incentives, how far it's gone to create this investor-driven pricing market. And there's a prominent real estate commentator in Canada named John Passalis that I like to follow, who says investors set the floor on prices because there's so many of them that the market just can't go down past the point because people rush in and buy more as a commodity the way you would like food or stocks because they believe it'll go back up. So the market floor cannot be reached, meaning that the floor reflecting people's need to live as opposed to investors' want for wealth. You asked about farmland.
Yeah, farmland. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a little tricky because it is. So new farmers will have access to cheaper lands because the middleman would be out of the way. Land would be cheap. You could acquire it with less of a mortgage. More land would be available, and so far you could have a lot more small scale farming, family oriented owned farms. And because again, we're suggesting here there's an income tax shift, right? So farmers who are productive keep more of their income and can afford to pay a land tax, which would be dramatically lower in rural areas than it would in city centers. The vast majority of land value is in the city centers. So this tax shift, in a sense, you could think about it as the cities sort of funding the countryside because the cities would be contributing most of the tax revenue versus land, north of Guelph and Fergus is much cheaper. So what it would do, and why back in the times of Adam Smith and the French Revolution, why people like this idea is because it gets the landlords, the lords of the land, gets them out of the way. Like Bill Gates bought 300,000 hectares of farmland. He's not going to be farming it himself. He's just a middleman, just reaping in the rent. So if we had this system, he'd have no reason to do that. Like, why would he acquire land and then rent it out and only keep a smaller share of the rental value of land? So it would be actual farmers owning their land. It would get the middleman out of the way, make things cheaper, and Bill Gates could invest in businesses instead.
Sounds very similar to much what the levelers and the diggers were saying a few hundred years ago. I'm going to follow up with a follow-up from Mandy as well. And it's one that is a real bugbear of mine, and that is tiny homes and accessory units. And full disclosure, as I say this, because I was able, I did help my daughter to buy a home elsewhere in the city where she's not living right now because she's working in Toronto and needs to finish up her work there before she moves to Guelph. So we're renting it out. It's a great place for an accessory unit or a tiny home. My problem with tiny homes are that they strike me as being a panacea for a housing crisis, and that they're not that at all. They're expensive. So the affordability element of housing isn't addressed at all. We've just concentrated more housing in smaller lots. And I think that this is something that really is part of what we're talking about. It's not about whether we have only the one solution for housing, but do we have the right solutions? So if you've got anything to say on tiny homes or accessory units, I'd love to hear from you on that as well.
I think that issue is more of a function of zoning, right? So if we relax zoning and allow our residential neighborhoods to develop more organically, there probably wouldn't be a need for tiny homes. It's also a function of how high prices have gone, that people are willing to live in tiny homes, and that's become a market. So yeah, I guess that issue is not really related to the solution, but on the solution of the land value tax shift, I just don't think the other solutions will ever really go far enough. If we don't address the fundamental economics, the fundamental market incentives that continue prices going up higher than need to be. So I just think, yeah, of course we need zoning change. Of course we need more public investment. We need more affordable housing. I support public housing. I mean, this is a crazy idea. Here's another crazy idea. Why don't we print $100 billion and then build a lot of housing with it? Because we know that money will be returned. Land prices always go up. So it's not like we're not going to create inflation with it. We're going to pay that money back. So public financing could play a much larger role in creating affordable housing than it does today. If we haven't shackled ourselves with these silly ideas about how we are and are not allowed to use our own ability to create money, to create assets and invest in infrastructure.
Okay. I think Mandy's question has been answered, but I do want to follow up on it, because one of the things that really concerns me is that I'm a firm believer that, quote, the euphemistic skyscraper is not the answer to housing at all. And in fact, actually, it's an environmental challenge. As there's an article in the Guardian just yesterday that pointed out that concrete emits more greenhouse gas into the environment than do all the passenger planes in the world. 8% of our greenhouse gases are produced by the production and use of concrete, much of which goes into high rises. So your points about fourplexes and sixplexes, I do value. But on the other hand, what I am also wanting to get at is, I don't think the sky's the limit. What's the limit on the size or the height of housing in your opinion?
Well, I don't have a professional opinion on it because I run a software developer education company. But I just know that if you go to other parts of the world, I mean, if you go to Europe, like any major capital, even mid-sized towns, anywhere in Europe, you see 5-story, 6-story places everywhere, and not in former communist countries, and everywhere in the West. So like the idea of having semi-detached and detached homes in city centers is just a strange relic, I think, of maybe expectations of past generations. A much larger share of housing in Europe is apartments than it is in single detached homes. You know, I've been to Tokyo, I've been to Manhattan, been to Sao Paulo in the course of my business career, and you see expanses of high rises as far as the eye can see. Maybe that's just what humanity needs. Like, isn't that better than LA, Los Angeles style urban sprawl where there's no more green space? So there's got to be. I'd rather have density with green space than sprawl with low rises or mid rises.
Thank you for your presentation. I think it's great. But for every economic system, I mean, there's always a downside. So I would like to request that if you could put your another hat on and just sort of give us a critique of what it is you've been describing. So, I mean, every system in some way has a downside. So,
yeah, I mean, I guess some critiques of it. Some critiques have been from people who have attacked the idea that this could ever be a single tax. Like many people who have, like ardent Georgists, believe that there should only be one tax and it should just be land and no other tax. So critiques of that is unrealistic, that it can't actually raise enough revenue to fully source government. Our own research at Commonwealth Canada, that's actually another think tank that we've been working. We started, myself and Ken here. We've done our own research, and we believe that this could raise $194 billion in Canada. Realistically, not. Some economists believe, by their numbers, it could raise $500 million, which would actually completely replace all federal and most provincial expenditures. But there's just no evidence of that, right? It's just theory at this point. So there is some concern that it may not go far enough. Role of government perspective, I personally worry about that. Like now we have the idea of rent evictions. Somehow society accepts because it's other people doing it, private interests doing it. You know, if a corporation screws you, it's not as bad as if the government screws you, right? But that's kind of a strange perspective. But we seem to accept it. So what happens if someone can't meet their land tax obligations? And it seems a bit scary. Like, does the government kick you out? That maybe that's a role of government that people might be concerned with, but it's no different from what happens now. If you're behind on your income taxes, you know, there are mechanisms for that, and you know, you have to renegotiate it, repay it, blah blah blah. So that part makes me a little uncomfortable. Yeah, some have said that most economists unanimously believe that a primarily land tax-based system would be more productive, incentivizes more innovation, capitalism would work better. Some believe there may be some categories of investment that it detracts Namely, someone said that we may not have Disneyland if we had a land value tax. So let me explain what I mean. So Disneyland was created on the backs of private land value accumulation. So apparently, in the area where Disneyland exists in Florida, a number of companies, but before it existed, bought a whole bunch of homes in an area, basically became a majority ownership of a whole region that was far away from everything else on the periphery. And then Disneyland was announced and built, and then the value of all those homes in the area went up. And it turns out that it was the owners of Disneyland who had bought those homes, and they realized the investment, the land value increase as a form of profit to pay for the construction or more of Disneyland. So those types of schemes might not work, but I argue that most of our economy doesn't really rely on those schemes. And in fact, this idea of land value capture, which is what Disneyland did, it would be a better source of taxation for government. Why can't we build more public transit? Because we're charging taxpayers to build a subway, which benefits the homeowners around the subway unfairly, because the homeowners didn't do anything, like the taxpayers around the country did. They invested it. They should reap the rewards. So another way we could finance, more public transit, we could have a hyperloop from coast to coast in Canada, financed by land value capture. If the areas around where the stations are, the government says, okay, this was the price before this investment, and this is whatever price increase after. That is lien on the property now, because that belongs to society, because society invested in building that train station. So we could have self-financing public investment if we realized a system more like land value tax or land value capture. And I realize that now I'm going to benefits again, but it's kind of a cool story, this Disneyland story, and this idea that we could have dramatic investments in public infrastructure if we did this. And this is why China has such dramatic investments in infrastructure, because their land leasing system more clumsily simulates this effect over the long term. And researchers have shown that that's why there's so much infrastructure investment, is because it's coming from rising land values that China is able to capture through this more indirect approach.
I think you mentioned the stock market a little while ago. And my question is, what role does your idea play, or how does it intersect with the stock market? Because I understand sometimes the stock market is totally separate. This thing can take place and the stock market just does its thing. So have I got that right? Or
Okay, I'm so glad you asked that question. So many economists believe and have proven that the business cycle is actually a function of the housing cycle, which is actually the land cycle. So what happens is there's a view that every 18 years or so, housing prices get too high, then people's ability to afford, eventually then consumption slows down because people don't have enough money, and eventually businesses slow down. So as soon as the housing prices start to fall, there's something called the wealth effects turn comes up, which actually I read about in the Financial Post even a year ago. When housing prices start to fall, people spend less because they're worried about falling net worth. And then that is actually what then drives a business cycle crash. So that the housing cycle drives the business cycle, not the other way around. Sometimes the other way around, if there's like an extreme event that's localized, like in 2002, there was a tech crash, a dot-com bubble burst, but it was pretty localized to that sector, versus the housing cycle drives the wider business cycle. So a lot of proponents of shifting to land value tax believe that we would no longer have booms and busts of any kind. Right? You would have just nice, slow and steady growth. That's a theory, but it sounds good.
Morgan asked, why is the government pushing personal home ownership? Because some people do not want the responsibility or cannot deal with the responsibility. Home ownership, you've got to take care of everything. Roofs, for example, are quite the expense. And 50% of people in Toronto and Vancouver are renters. So why is the government pushing for personal home ownership? And I guess we're talking about the federal government.
Just politics. I think we've been raised in an environment where I think the home ownership dream, which some have argued is marketing pushed by banks, just like cigarettes was pushed by companies at some point, is somehow better. And I mean, the economics are there. It is better economically, as I mentioned earlier in the talk. But it's just good economics. I think they'll get them elected, and it's what people, because the struggles of people who want to buy a home and customize the home and make it their own, or want to get in as a wealth creation vehicle. These are these are the voters that everyone's pursuing. So I think that's why. But in other cultures, it's not that way. Like in parts of Europe, there's like 70-80% renters, and those are perfectly great places to live too.
I think there's a couple of other reasons too, Tanya, and that is that housing is expensive. And I believe firmly that that's why the provincial and the federal governments got out of affordable housing. They don't want to pay for the roofs. They don't want to pay for the infrastructure upkeep. And that's fairly important. And that fits very well into the national psyche as well, where essentially we're all Duddy Kravitz. We're nobody unless we own land. And that particular principle is something that I believe has been fixed into us since we really entered kindergarten. Land makes you whom it is that you. Oh, I think that there's a tremendous push, an emotional push for us to be homeowners. And remember, finally, what I said earlier, that for many people, to own a home, to finish off a mortgage while you're working becomes a nest egg. And I think that that's really important. But now I see Tanya's yelling at me. Dude, one more question. Go ahead, Tanya.
Okay, so we have talked about the investment side of purchasing homes. That is, people who purchase homes and they do not live in them. How have real estate investment trusts, how have they affected housing? And how can we get rid of them?
Well, I haven't studied it, but just as someone who's business minded, I can say what I think is probably happening. You remember the mortgage-backed securities crisis in 2008? They securitized mortgages and created secondary and tertiary and like all these markets that were buying and trading on properties that they would never even see or even know where they are. So REITs simply enable a class of investors to get in on the game in a simple way through a few button clicks on their investment portfolio websites. So they generally probably just make the problem a bit worse depending on what they're investing in, because it's almost securitizing housing in a way that it makes it accessible to more people. But I don't think that's necessarily the problem. The problem is that society's not claiming this increasing value of lands. Like REITs could serve a great function if they're financing construction and if they're financing secondary markets to buy not constructed rental units that are being rented. Like we need that in society. So I don't blame large holders. They're part of the same incentive structure we are. So like if we're willing to give up the prize, then they will too.
Great. Quick question from Glenn here, Tanya.
Earlier you mentioned about farmland and farmers, with your land tax or tax value on the tax on the value of the land. I'm guessing then that certain types of land, like farmland, would have a different valuation than swampland, than land that you're putting buildings and that on. I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around that because you said that the farmland would be cheap. What then is to prevent developers, like they're doing right now, going in and people with huge amounts of money going in and buying up all the farmland, and then getting a zoning classification that it's no longer farmland, you can just build on it. So I'm assuming then that that's going to increase the value of the land, that they'd have to pay more to build on it. But in the meantime, we're losing farmland, precious farmland. We need that. How do we protect that?
Yeah, so the theory of land value tax is that it encourages land to put to its most productive use. So if society decides that this certain area is better for farming and not for residential, then that is the highest productive use. If the market votes for this area, it really should be residential because maybe it's on the outskirts of Guelph, or I live near Rockwood. If it's become prime for residential, then maybe that's the highest, most productive use. And the only way to interrupt that is through zoning. So we're not saying ditch the greenbelt, keep the greenbelt. So I think government still needs to decide if they're going to go against the market forces to maintain certain outcomes by having zoning. So any area that's only zoned for farming, then I think this LVT system would simply operate within that constraint. That any farmer that is productive would realize hopefully a gain because the land tax would be quite low And there's already carve-outs in the property tax system for having forests. You can have a lower property tax bill. All that stuff could still continue. My one worry in that case is for families that are living on large plots that are not being productively used, that maybe should be farms. They would have to leave because that land should be farmed, and that would upset a lot of people who have generational homes. So maybe the government would allow them to stay until the death of the first primary owner. But I have family friends who are in that situation where they have a multi-generational plot of land, and it's not being productively used. So they would have to farm it themselves, or let a farmer lease their land from them and pay, so they can afford to pay the land tax bill and come out neutrally. So this encourages productivity and discourages underutilization.
Floyd, I want to thank you very much. Looks like Floyd has a question for me. So I'm going to let him go, and then I'm going to let him ask the question. And then I'm going to remind people that amongst us all, there are many people who have suffered from rent evictions, as was mentioned, and that it is interesting that we do give permission to landowners to rent evict, and yet we have the belief that that it's okay because it's private property. So, Floyd, your question.
So, with respect to, I'm assuming I'm speaking to a lot of people who own their homes and have them paid off. So, would you vote for this policy that would, in the short term, maybe go against your financial interests because you have a lot of equity in your homes, but would benefit future generations and your children and grandchildren? Now, that's loaded. I loaded that question with a lot of moral judgment. I'm sorry.
Oh, there's nothing worse than moral judgment. I'm not going to pass the mic around because we're just about at the end, but I will say that for myself, I have no problem with that at all. I'm not worried for myself. I'm very comfortable, and I'll be quite honest about that. I think that for me, I have been in some senses the beneficiary of neoliberal economics, which has seen an incredible spread in wealth over the last 40 years. That's not the case for most people, and that's whom we should be looking at. So the moral judgment to me is quite appropriate, and I want to thank you for it. And like land value taxes, they've let us think outside the box about what we can do on an issue that is front and center, was front and center in the most recent Toronto mayoral by-election, and will continue to be an issue through the next elections. So with that, Tanya, I want to thank Floyd and his techie, Ken, for being here to make this a very, very provocative, interesting, and enriching conversation on what next to do for housing. Tanya, over to you.
Okay, so here are the announcements. Have your say, please. We've got Guelph's bicentennial coming up. So if you have any great ideas about how to celebrate it, please submit your ideas to the Have Your Say website. That's haveyoursayguelph.ca. The culture plan for Guelph, the race to zero, and that's zero emissions, the downtown parking master plan, and the downtown infrastructural renewal. Bill 97, one of my favorites. What can you do? Comment on the ERO by August 4th. Please Google ERO proposed policy. And I'm glad we were talking about agricultural farmland just recently in this podcast. Ontario farmers have pushed back on Bill 97, so you can too. Canada Day, there are events happening at Riverside Park. Tea and Tales will happen at the Enabling Garden at 10:30 a.m., featuring Robert Munch and James Gordon. And there will be fireworks at 10 p.m. And finally, next week on Breezy Breakfast, we're going to be taking a deep dive into water and wastewater with Nectar Tampakopoulos. He is the General Manager of Environmental Services at Guelph. And that's it for the announcements. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to Floyd, and we'll see you next week.
And Tanya, thank you for your voice being nectar to our ears.
That's all for today. Special thanks to our guest Floyd, who suggested that we do some serious out-of-the-box thinking when it comes to the housing crisis. Music is provided by Jules Germ. This valuable and tax-free podcast was produced by me, Long Fei Chen. See you next week.